Welcome to episode 479. On today's show, have elite evangelicals sold out in order to be affirmed by the mainstream media? Or have the populist evangelicals sold out in order to win the support of Trump voters? We unpack the debate dividing the evangelical subculture and why it might not be anything new. Then Kaitlyn Schiess interviews Duke Divinity School history professor Kate Bowler about the subtle ways the prosperity gospel affects all of us, and how her battle with cancer has uncovered the lies we like to tell in the church, such as, everything happens for a reason. You do not want to miss this conversation, I promise. All of that, plus Phil regales us with squirrel facts. Here is the Holy Post.
Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. I am here with Sky Jutani. Hi, Sky.
Hi, Phil.
If you're watching the video, Sky is reclining today. He's
Yes.
reclining. Apparently, it was a rough weekend. Maybe we'll hear about it, but he doesn't have the energy to even sit up on his own. And Christian Taylor. Hi, Christian.
Hey, Phil. How are you guys doing?
Good. After the theme song, we'll have to find out where you've been lately and where you are now. And Jason Rugg. Hi, Jason.
Hey there.
And here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay, Christian, it's been a couple weeks. Where have you been? You were in Holland when we last talked to you. You were being fooled by the Dutch to believe that they all wear wooden shoes all of the time, and it's a perfectly natural thing. And
Yes, it was
sounded like you were starting to fall for it.
I did fall for it. I actually saw a farmer wearing wooden shoes. So there was proof there, Phil. It was not some sort of mind control. Mm-hmm. But I did leave
it was
Holland.
Very effective mind control, one or the other.
Well, you may have a point there, but I think our listeners tend to disagree with you. They've been posting on Twitter all sorts of contrary evidence that you are wrong and I am right.
Yes, that is true. There were quite a few people that took issue with my disparagement of the veracity of historical wooden shoe wearing in Holland. So I will let that point go.
Okay, excellent. So then from Holland, I went to Belgium, and I actually was in Bastogne, and I was in the foxholes of Easy Company as they were looking over the little town of Foy.
Wow.
So that was very powerful. I actually brought home some moss to kind of keep it alive. It's still alive, moss. Thank goodness.
Can you travel with live moss?
Somehow
I can do that.
No, somehow I got away with it, you guys. And even, get this, they stopped me, they searched my bag, and they took out presents that I had bought. I bought these little metal, like, Tinkerbells that you stick in your plants. And so they took those out. And while they were looking at the metal Tinkerbell, they took out the moss and the pine cone and the tree bark that I had in the Ziploc bag. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm really dead now. And they were so concerned with the little spike of Tinkerbell, they just stuck all of the plant material back in the suitcase. And while they were doing that, I was thinking, gosh, I wonder, am I not supposed to have that?
Okay, Christian.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm no like TSA agent or government employee that's trying to monitor things, but we're hopefully on the tail end of a global pandemic that has spread because of international travel. And there's supposed to be regulations about not bringing plant material and vegetation.
Did you declare it?
No, but I didn't know that was a problem until I got somewhere and I saw some sign that said something about you can't bring those things because they could have bugs, and it asked you, are you bringing anything? And I thought, well, I already have it and I might as well just quickly go through. So, okay, I repent. I did something wrong.
No. Have you not heard of the Asian longhorned beetle?
Well, yes, I have. But the thing was, I was so excited that I had moss from the foxholes that Easy Company was in that I didn't think about the fact that it may have bugs in it. So I forgot that part.
Oh,
but anyway.
Here comes Dutch elm disease, round 3.
Seriously.
Well, I didn't see any bugs, if it makes you feel any better.
Well, I didn't see any viruses either.
Yeah, it's the bugs you can't see that you need to worry about.
Seriously, yeah.
Because you
Yeah.
can't see them. Any murder hornets in your
I
bark?
didn't bring back any murder hornets.
Just eggs. Just some little eggs.
What
We'll
about
see what they are when they hatch.
What about Nazi gnats?
Ooh, Nazi
Oh,
gnats.
no. I didn't, but I did go to Germany, by the way. So after I left Belgium, then I went to Germany. And I almost was in Luxembourg, but it didn't happen.
Oh,
So it was quite
wow.
the European World War II history tour.
Okay. That's fantastic. I need to talk about, we need something a little light, because,
Any animal news?
it's a heavy world. It's not animal news, it's animal facts. And particularly, I think we all need to know a little bit more about squirrels today.
Ooh, I like that.
Don't you, Sky, don't you think wouldn't you agree that we need to know a little more about squirrels?
I'm going to withhold judgment until I hear what you have for us, Phil.
Yeah,
Okay.
as long as it's not about squirrel poop news, then I'm
No, it's
good.
not squirrel poop news. I don't do, what kind of show do you think this is? I got 5 interesting things we're going to learn about squirrels today. Okay, it won't take very long, and you're going to love it. So you can thank me in advance, except Sky, he probably won't even thank me after he realizes it was very valuable information. But that's okay. I understand. I don't take it personally. Squirrel facts. Did you know that squirrels actually organize their nut hordes?
I did not.
We all know that squirrels collect nuts, right? Did
Yeah.
you know they organize them? Tree squirrels use a mnemonic technique called spatial chunking. Spatial chunking. That's the
That's like-
technique.
What is that?
That's how I eat at an all-you-can-eat buffet. When you fill your plate, you have to
Yes.
spatially chunk it.
Yes, that's exactly right. To sort out and bury their nuts by size, type, and perhaps, we're not sure, but perhaps nutritional value and taste. Tree squirrels use spatial chunking to sort their nuts. Okay, that's fact number 1 that I thought everyone needed to know today. Fact number 2, the American red squirrel is small, territorial, and aggressive.
I've seen
This is
that
not
on my back
news.
porch.
This
Yeah.
is
I
not
didn't say
news.
it. I told you it wasn't news. I said this is not news. These are animal facts.
Okay, but if they're widely known facts, then it shouldn't. Why are we using our time?
Fact 3. Hey, did you know about spatial chunking? No, you didn't.
That's legit, but the second one is not.
Fact 3. Squirrels can be left or right-handed. Did you know that?
Who
Left-handed
cares? Who
How
cares?
do they even tell that?
But squirrels that favor one paw over the other perform less well at learning tasks. So if
Well,
squirrels...
I will testify to this because there are some red
Yes,
squirrels
yes.
on the back of my porch. You know, I feed them in my reverse zoo little peanuts in this box, and some
Yeah.
of them easily go in and they get the nuts and they jump back out. And then there are some stupid ones that just can't figure out how to open the box, and they just watch everybody else and don't learn how.
Yeah, are those the ones that favor their left or right paws? You need to look more
Probably.
closely at that. Okay, fact number 4. Ghostly white squirrels haunt a town in Transylvania County, North Carolina. We learned a couple of things there, didn't we? There's a
Wait.
county in North Carolina called Transylvania.
Are there photographs of these squirrels?
Yes, they're white. They're all white. And there's a rumor about where they came from. About a third of the population of eastern gray squirrels in the town of Brevard, North Carolina, the county seat of Transylvania County, are leucistic, meaning they have white fur and dark eyes. They're not albino, they're leucistic.
Is that like related to the word Lucifer?
I don't know, but it's genetic.
Are
And
they vampire squirrels?
It is believed that they may have descended from a pair of white squirrels that were in a traveling circus that came through town long ago, and a lady kept them and tried to breed them, but couldn't get them to breed successfully, so she just let them go.
This sounds like the premise of like a Pixar movie.
The white squirrels of Transylvania County?
Yeah. Or some kind of
Yeah.
Adam Sandler animated movie that
Yeah,
nobody
sure.
should see.
And which role is Adam Sandler playing?
He's the woman who's trying to breed squirrels.
Oh, good. Yeah,
Hmm.
that makes sense.
He could
Okay,
also be the squirrels himself.
and I've got one more fact. I know you want lots more, but I only have one more, and then this will be the end of the animal fact news segment. Squirrels are hardwired to dance when a car is coming.
What?
Like how they
This
like
is not
jump
a
back and
real.
forth
This
kind
is
of.
not a
They can't decide
real.
which way to go.
Yeah. Do you know how you're driving down? Have you ever driven down the street and a squirrel's in the middle of the street and then they run one way to get out of the way, but then they run back the other way to get out of the way, and then they run back the other way, and then you run over them by accident?
That's not dancing.
Zigzagging.
Yeah, dancing is like something you do rhythmically to music for entertainment. It's not how you avoid getting run over by a car.
Sky.
Also,
Why-
I don't think this is real facts. I
Why
think you're
do you-
making these
Why do you
up.
got to pee on my news? Why you got to pee on my news?
I'm not peeing on it. I'm more crapping on it.
Oh, okay, thank you. They zigzag, and quite often it leads to them getting hit by cars, not avoiding cars, which confuse people because squirrels are pretty smart. You know, they're good they can learn obstacle courses, they can learn all sorts of things, but they have an instinct. And this is the theory. You're going to love this. This zigzag instinct is believed to have developed as squirrels were trying to avoid hawks and predatory birds that were swooping down to grab them. So they would freak out and run back and forth, and it made it hard for the hawks to grab them. It doesn't work with cars, though. Sky.
I'm trying to
This is even harder to sell when you're reclining.
It is. Okay, it's a theory. I don't understand why it matters that much.
Well, so you can understand more. You have to be when you're driving down the road and you see a squirrel and you think, oh, he's surely going to get out of the way. You have to remember he has an instinct to zigzag, so you need to slow down and give him a chance to do a couple laps back and forth before he finally gets out of your way.
I think the answer is evolution needs to move a little quicker.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sky,
the solution is you hit all the squirrels you can with your car.
Yeah, and then
the ones who don't
natural selection.
Yeah, the ones who don't zigzag will actually be able to reproduce, and you'll get that characteristic out of the population because the major threat is no longer hawks, at least not here in the suburbs. It's cars.
Right. So what you're saying is set aside the love of Jesus and instead embrace Darwinism and the survival of the fittest. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right.
Couldn't God have created survival of the fittest just into our society? Why does Darwin and God have to be in conflict with one another?
No one created survival of the fittest. Just if you're more fit, you're more likely to survive.
Oh, well, of course, that's what I mean. It's built into our rhythm of life.
Well, yeah, but that's a whole different conversation. Whether that's a mechanism for the development of species is the main conversation to have. But we're not having that conversation today.
Fair enough.
Sky, anything you want to throw in there?
Yeah, this may all be moot because, the natural world in North America is probably going to die now because of what Christian brought back from Belgium.
Oh, boy. What we have unleashed.
I won't let it out of my house.
We did that story about the scientists in the Himalayas pulling up ice cores and discovering 30 brand new viruses and then shipping them to Ohio for safekeeping.
Now, I did not do that. That was not what I did.
Yeah, but I bet those were at least in some kind of container.
We don't know how many viruses were in your moss. Hey, how many viruses are in your moss?
Okay, they were in a Ziploc bag until they got to my house. So
now they're out. So whatever's in there is spreading around your house. Oh, man, we're all going down. Okay, we got an issue. We got an issue in evangelicalism. We all believe we are in evangelicalism or are attempting to be in evangelicalism, or at least we're raised in evangelicalism and have fondness for evangelicalism. But what we're really wrestling with now is are we elite evangelicals? And if we are we selling out?
Well, if we have David French on our podcast as many times as we have, and if we have him anymore, we are going to be guilty by association. I can tell you that.
Okay.
Okay, Sky.
On the flip side, though, if Phil keeps doing news of the butt and ridiculous facts about squirrels, I think it's pretty clear evidence that we're not very elite.
They organize their nuts, Sky. Organized. Why can't we? The Bible should say, instead of look to the ant, it should say, look to the squirrel. Look to the squirrel, ye sluggard, and organize your nuts by size.
Did they have squirrels in ancient Israel?
I don't know. Mike Naraki did a show called Dead Sea Squirrels, which is about ancient Israeli squirrels.
But I will tell you, they don't have them in Europe, at least where I have been. So
they have squirrels. They totally have squirrels.
No, they don't.
Black Forest.
In France,
Black Forest is full of squirrels.
Well, in France, for sure they don't, because I've had this conversation with French people. They haven't seen squirrels. They come here and they're like, "Oh, what are those?" No.
What do they have? Little lizards like in Florida?
They have hares, which are ginormous. I don't know if you've ever seen
Rabbits?
a hare. Yeah.
Isn't it just a rabbit?
Well, it's a very big rabbit. Like, I thought it was like, you've seen those jackalopes?
There's a giant hare in that Aardman movie, the Wallace and Gromit movie. Attack of the Were-Rabbit. Yeah, that's what it is. Attack of the Were-Rabbit. Okay. So a week ago, this all happened in the last week. It's amazing how fast things can unfold. About a week ago, the American Conservative published an article that said by two, I don't know, conservative Americans, because it was in the American Conservative, that's the best I can guess, about the future of evangelicalism, and that evangelicalism needed to make a choice to go down one of two paths. And path one...
Hold on. It's by Jackson Waters and Emma Posey. So it's by Posey Waters.
Posey Waters. Yeah. My favorite Beatles song. So path one was reflected in the meeting that Russell Moore, an event that Russell Moore put together with Beth Moore, his wife, and also David French was there, sponsored by Christianity Today. And the purpose of that event was to talk about them leaving the SBC, and when you know when you need to leave, when you know when you should stay, and how we can help evangelicalism become healthy. Okay. That was one of the events. The other event was a Doug Wilson event. Doug Wilson is the very controversial pastor from Moscow, Idaho, who we won't dive in there deeply, but he's very controversial and messing up Bethlehem Baptist Church in absentia, among other things, and wrote a book that slavery wasn't as bad as they say it was. So this said that the Russell Moore style evangelicals are evangelical elites that are just trying to be liked by the mainstream media. And because they're trying to be liked by the mainstream media, they've given up on their doctrinal commitments and distinctives. And the future really needs to be more Doug Wilson, who doesn't care what the mainstream media thinks about him and sticks with the Bible. That was the conclusion of this article. Then Mark Galli, like a couple days later, Mark Galli, good close personal friend of Sky's. They still go backpacking together once a year in France. Sky.
None of that's true, and Beth Moore is not Russell Moore's wife. Let's just set the record straight.
Man, people aren't going to believe me when I tell them about squirrels. Okay. Mark Galli is the former editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. He got to work together with Sky. He's been on the podcast. One of our year one episodes, I think, had Mark Galli on the podcast. He's the one who came out strongly calling for Trump to be removed from office. And then people said, oh, Christianity Today is liberal now, and Billy Graham would be rolling over in his grave. Anyway, Mark Galli retired a year or two ago, became Catholic, and then wrote a piece last week talking about evangelical elites and how they're compromising their convictions to get the approval of mainstream press, basically echoing this other article, which he quoted from.
Now, does that mean he is no longer an evangelical?
He no longer considers himself an evangelical.
But he's able to then comment on this evangelical
Yeah, and
situation.
he even called out his own former magazine that he was the editor of as part of the evangelical elite and part of the problem of wanting to. He talked about how excited people were at Christianity Today when they got quoted in, the New York Times or something. And he says, his position was, well, the New York Times should be excited if we quote them, which is kind of a silly thing to say. Anyway, the notion is there are too many evangelicals that want to be friends with the world, and are willing to compromise to do so. David French was dragged into that by, he was also in the Mark Galli piece, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And InterVarsity Press and like a whole list, World Vision. These are all evangelical elite institutions, and they're all in danger of compromising because they want to be friends with the world. And then that led David French to write a piece on Sunday. So much can happen in a week. David French wrote a piece entitled Evangelical Elites Fighting Each Other. And he wanted to respond to the fact that it was being claimed that he was compromising his values because he occasionally is published in Time and The Atlantic and other places. And he kind of took offense to that.
Boy, he sure did. He wielded the pen, the mighty pen, with a roar.
Yeah, the essay, Galli's essay, referenced various named elite evangelical institutions, including Christianity Today, and prominent former Southern Baptists Russell Moore and Beth Moore, who are married, and me. According to Galli, we represent a form of cultural accommodation dressed as convictional religion. So we say we have orthodox beliefs, but we're just trying to accommodate the culture. And then Carl Trueman, I forgot about that. Carl Trueman, writing for First Things, another Christian thinker, jumped in and echoed the same critique that if we want to be, that these elite evangelicals, in their desire to appease religion's cultured despisers, are now echoing woke outrage. We don't have convictions. Instead, we're auditioning for membership in an exclusive club. We want to be liked by the New York Times. Sky, is that why you do what you do? Are you an evangelical elite, Sky?
No, I don't think I'm any of those things, but it's
You're
all
not
in
an
the eye of the
evangelical?
beholder, I suppose. Um, Here's what I don't get, and I think David French addresses this in his piece. In none of these articles, either Mark Galli's article or the American Spectator, whatever was that thing called,
American
American
conservative.
Conservative, none of them cite any examples of Beth Moore, Russell Moore, David French, or even Christianity Today changing their position on anything in order to find approval from the secular elite or the political class or the New York Times. Like, if they can't cite a single example of somebody changing their position, then I don't think they have an argument here. On the flip side, we can all cite dozens of people who have flip-flopped their views on politics and character since the Donald Trump years in order to win the approval of the populist movement of Donald Trump. So who's really moved away from their Christian convictions in order to win approval? I don't think it's the people who are being labeled elites.
Here's what Carl Trueman says. He says, let me put it bluntly. Talking in an outraged voice about racism within the boundaries set by the woke culture is an excellent way of not talking about the pressing moral issues on which Christianity and the culture are opposed to each other, LGBTQ issues, and abortion.
Right. And
So he's saying we talk about race to avoid talking about gay rights and abortion.
Russell Moore, Beth Moore, and David French have probably done more on the issue of abortion and gay marriage than anyone on the far right over the course of their career. They haven't changed their convictions. They've spoken out on those issues and they continue to. I mean, we've done whole podcasts with David French about abortion in the last 2 years. I think the bigger issue is, yes, they do speak out about racism and sexual abuse within the church. And that's what has really extreme people on the right upset with them and is calling them woke. So they haven't changed at all. They're just unwilling to be silent about other issues that also matter.
Uh-huh.
If that makes someone an elitist, I think it just makes them a Christian.
Uh, uh-huh. Okay. Well, how do we define elite?
Well,
I
I
think it's a
think,
bad label. I think it's a terrible label for what they're trying to talk about.
and what I think is this is the question that I have. It usually is elite in the political world is usually associated with the schooling of, Harvard and Yale and Princeton. And, it's all of the smart people on the East Coast who have this, hoity toity education. But, the educational elite or the educated people, why are they labeled as bad? Like, why is it bad to be educated or to go to good schools or to think deeply about things? That's what I don't understand.
Look, what did the communists have to do to try to take over a country so they could turn it into a workers' paradise? They had to get rid of all the elites.
Meaning
See? So if
people
we
that were educated
Yes,
and had
yes. Yes, like Cambodia. Like, again and again, who do you need to get rid of? You need to get rid of all the really educated people, all the doctors and lawyers and college professors. Otherwise, you can't have a workers' paradise. So we need to get rid of the elites in America if we want to be communist.
But the irony is the people who are against the elites in America are the ones who claim to be the most anti-socialist.
I know, I know. It's a little bit ironic, isn't it? It's a populist movement where, we say as populists, oh, only the common man. Well, look, okay, Van Gogh. Van Gogh had huge admiration for the peasant class. That's where he
Mhm.
saw the love of God was in the peasant families and then the love expressed in them. He had very low esteem for priests and, kind of the upper class, especially religious. So he was anti-elite.
Right.
So, and you like him.
I do.
So
But
you
I
need
don't like everything I like as art. I
you
don't
need
like
to
his
be
point of view.
against yourself.
It depends. It's kind of like saying, are all poor people automatically admirable? Of
The
course not,
the
because
noble savage, the
there are
noble
some
savage,
there are some
romanticism.
there are some criminally poor people. And it's like saying, are all elite people to be admired? Of course not. There are some evil elite people or people who are elites and are just flat out wrong. So I just think it's a terrible category to try to define the current tensions that are within the American church. I think what's really going on here, and there's more nuances that we can get into, but I think what's really going on here is the friction between historical evangelicals and neo fundamentalists. And it's the same tension that's been in the American church, at least the white church, for the last 150 years. It's just no one wants to call themselves a fundamentalist anymore. And so they're claiming the label evangelical and saying that those who don't agree with them are elite evangelicals, when in fact they're just evangelicals and the other folks are fundamentalists. They just don't want to
but
use that language anymore because it doesn't sound sexy.
well, and that sounds like a very good explanation. But what I'm confused about is in, simple terms, not using terms like, evangelical elitism and fundamentalism. But you look at what they're saying, and it sounds like at bottom, if you don't think like we think, and if you don't talk like we talk, you're not in our club and you're wrong.
Who these critical articles?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I have gotten a lot of criticism personally for talking about racism as much as we have. And then the question is always, why aren't you talking about abortion as much as you're talking about racism? To which my response is typically, we have talked about abortion a lot over the last 40 years in conservative Christianity. It is not a blind spot in conservative Christianity.
Right.
Racism has been a blind spot in conservative Christianity, and that's why we're pointing the spotlight there to have some really serious, meaningful heart-to-heart conversations about racism. But the thought is, because the larger culture says they're concerned about racism, you're just trying to be friends with the larger culture. You're trying to impress the New York Times. I don't care if I'm ever in the New York Times. I have no desire to ever be in the New York Times. That's not a big concern of mine. But it is interesting that if your concerns align in any way with institutions that we consider on the left, you're selling out to try to get the approval of those institutions. If your concerns align with institutions on the right, you have conviction and you're sticking with your principles.
Right.
How did we get there?
Well, we've talked about that a lot. I mean, we got there because an awful lot of Christians in the United States, again, mostly white Christians, have had their imaginations primarily shaped by political discourse rather than the scriptures. And so, if your imagination is the world is divided between conservatives and liberals, and if you're a conservative, then anyone who's a Christian needs to be a conservative like you, and that's the framework you impose on everybody. And it's not helpful. And I think that's exactly why Russell Moore, Beth Moore, David French, you, Phil, me, others in the Christianity Today kind of orbit are getting criticized here, is because they don't fit neatly into the conservative political box.
Right.
And therefore you must want the approval of the world. And
Well,
that's just a very blunt way of trying to deal with what isn't it's an unnuanced way of looking at things. And they did this to
here,
Jesus 2,000 years ago. There were moments where Jesus agreed with the Pharisees about certain doctrines like the resurrection or divorce, and other groups in ancient Judaism didn't agree. Would anyone say that Jesus was a fan of the Pharisees? Of course not. He took them to task. He went nuts on them in Matthew 23 and elsewhere. But there were times where he agreed with their doctrines, and the critics then accused Jesus on the other side. Likewise, there are moments when evangelicals are going to agree with people on the left. It doesn't mean we're leftist. It doesn't mean we're socialist. It just means there are particular moments where we align theologically or culturally. And that's where people who are sold out on the right criticize evangelicals because you're not completely with us. You must be woke and on the left.
but here's my question. When society, at large, or the elites in our society, when they bring up something that is clearly a problem and they're talking about it in the public square, and we as Christians begin to look at it and listen to see whether or not it is really a problem, I don't understand why that is bad. And that's really what's happening here as I've watched, what you guys have done over the time, and even David French, is that there is this, cultural conversation that we're having in the public square. And I watched, you guys spend a lot of time researching and listening. You in particular, Phil, you researched, you listened, and you did all that before you made a video, right? And so, because in listening to this big, kerfuffle, you realize there was merit there. Well, as Christians, isn't that what we're called to do?
Listen.
Yes. Listen and look inside ourselves and see, is there any grain of truth there that we can
Yeah,
admit or accept?
it is tricky because there is one point of view within conservative Christianity that we have the truth. We're the ones that have the truth. It's in this book. All the answers are in this book. Someone just criticized me yesterday on Twitter because I have a new podcast, but Jesus hardly ever comes up on it. I'm supposed to be a Christian, supposed to be a Christian podcast, and there's no Christ in our podcast. And I wasn't even sure what that meant, other than that we don't quote Bible verses regularly. I don't know. It's like there was no Bible in that. There was no Bible verses in that. And that's where truth comes from. Because you didn't quote Bible verses specifically, forget about framing biblical truth in a larger picture or worldview, because you didn't say Romans, 4:17, this isn't a Christian podcast. And I find that logic a little curious.
Well, it feels very narrow. And I've been thinking about that. Like this week I read Thessalonians and Paul talking about how, really we should stay away from all of those controversies and legalistic stuff that people want to draw you into. And that's what this argument feels like to me. I can
Yeah.
certainly see Paul coming back and talking to, these writers of these articles, or, and be like, hey, you guys, you know, this is all, you're missing the mark of who
Yeah.
Christ is and how he came to draw people together, not separate them over legalistic issues.
I think that touches on another element of this whole thing, which David French addressed in his article, and that is, and this is not unique to Christianity, but I think it's going throughout the country, is there is a divide that's emerged both on political conservatives and political progressives between liberal and illiberal people. And I mean that in the classical sense of those words. Um, illiberal, illiberal means you want no room for dissent, no room for ideas that you don't agree with, no freedom of speech, total power and control by your tribe alone. And that is fundamentalism, right? That's the goal, both on the right and on the left. Whereas traditional liberalism, in the classical sense, is a free society in which people have access to a freedom of ideas, where there's freedom of speech, where in the marketplace of ideas, we can debate and have the best ideas rise to the surface. There's freedom of expression. It's the foundation of the United States and this republic. But there are major forces, both in conservatism and progressivism, that don't want liberalism anymore. They want absolutism. They want fundamentalism, where your speech is predetermined, what ideas are allowed are predetermined. And I think that's the divide you're seeing in evangelicalism today. Is there's this resurgent fundamentalism that says you're not allowed to question anything, you're not allowed to doubt anything, you're not allowed to agree with anybody that we disagree with, and if you do, you are shunned and kicked out. That's why I
Right.
think this isn't a debate between elites and populists. It's a debate between fundamentalists and classic evangelicals.
Uh, um, to me, it seems like it shows the heightened tribalism that's
Hmm.
going on, in that, the people that are being criticized by conservative Christians, because I'm a conservative Christian. Hey, guess what? I'm a conservative Christian. But some people say, we think you've switched teams. We think you've switched teams because either you took this position on this one cultural issue, or you're talking to people that we think are from the other team. You're hanging out with the wrong people, you're reading the wrong books, you're having the wrong guests on your podcast. We are fearful that you have changed teams. And the only reason we can think of that you would change teams, assuming that's what's happened, is because you've either sold out or you just want to be liked. You want to be liked by the world. And it shows that it's like everyone who knows that I didn't vote for Trump then says, I can't believe he voted for Biden. They never bother asking if I did. There's
Hmm.
never, and like, same thing with David French. Everyone who says, oh, he's an anti-Trumper, so he was one of those evangelicals for Biden. Well, no, actually, he wasn't. I don't think he signed that to be an evangelical for Biden. I think his belief in the middle was, if neither side produces a candidate that you can put your name next to, don't put your name next to either of the major party candidates as a protest. So, but people can't hold that. Like, that makes their heads explode.
Right.
That to be against my side on this issue must mean that you're now on the other side on every issue. And we can't just get our minds around the fact that you can hold these things in tension, and that you can have allegiances that are higher than one or the other tribe, as we've defined them that way, to say, no, I'm trying to find biblical truth wherever it is. Sometimes it's on the right, sometimes it's on the left, sometimes it's in the middle, sometimes it's out the back door across the street, and we're so far from it we can't even find it anymore. But let's find biblical truth where it is, and stop worrying so much about whether we're perceived as being, leftists or rightists or centrists or libertarians, and let's just try to be perceived as Christians. It's just really hard to do that in America today.
Well, and I have to be honest with you, when I was over in Europe and I was going through all of these museums in Holland, and I was listening to what time was like there in the 1940s, from like 1939 to 1945, what struck me was exactly that. There were so many columns of people, so many echo chambers. There were socialists, there were communists, there were Catholics, there were Protestants, there were, Christians, and they were all in this stew. And if you were not in their one particular, echo chamber, you were out and you were the enemy. And you never knew. I mean, the country is very tiny, and so they were always concerned with having no idea where people stood, so they didn't really talk to each other. Everything was in whispers, and you had no idea if somebody was going to turn you in and your family was going to be executed. Now that's to the extreme, but when I was over there, I started seeing this, what you were talking about, Sky, this extremism on both sides that began to dominate the conversation. And it gave rise to terrible things. And part of me feels like, when I was reading David French's article, you know it's so confusing as to who is on what side and who's labeling so and so as bad. I don't know. It just feels really yucky. Yucky that
Yeah.
Christians would be, saying to another group of Christians, you're just wanting to please, the populace, and therefore you're not a real Christian. You're not quoting scripture so clearly. You are not a Christian. I mean, that's horrible.
Well, and that gets to one of the core arguments that Mark Galli was trying to make, which I think is flawed, is that these quote unquote elite Christians just want the approval of the press and the political elites. Yesterday, for example, on Sunday, Russell Moore was interviewed on Meet the Press, right? So classic example of, oh, well, he's clearly pandering to, the mainstream media or whatever. And what that reveals is that there's a segment of Christians and evangelicals in America who believe that if you're persecuted or if you're despised, if you're hated, it's validation that you must be right. But they never go a step deeper and ask, why are they being despised? We're told in scripture, as far as we can, we should live at peace with all people. Being at peace with the people around you, being at peace with your neighbors, being at peace with your non-Christian friends, neighbors, and relatives is not a sign that you don't belong to Christ. Just as being a combatant a-hole is not evidence that you do belong to Christ. So if we are going to be persecuted and rejected because of our faith, fine, so be it. Let the world hate us. But if we're being despised because we're prejudiced, because we're racist, because we're homophobes, because we're intolerant, because we're jerks imposing our views on everyone around us, that's not a mark of pride. That's not something we should be excited about as Christians. And I think the fact that a Russell Moore or a David French is invited onto these news shows and their views are respected and heard, it's not because they have gone soft on the gospel or they don't stand for Jesus. It's because they are exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit and seeking to live at peace with all people and allowing the gospel itself to be a point of contention or offense rather than their character. And I mean, this is exactly why we've put up with so many terrible pastors recently. And we've heard the stories through like the rise and fall of Mars Hill, is we think that some of these very abrasive and acidic pastors, well, they're just standing up for the gospel. Therefore, that's good for them. And in fact, no, they're just being jerks.
Yeah.
And that's not something that we should be celebrating. But a lot of people in fundamentalism celebrate exactly that quality. And I don't want any part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some quotable quotes there, Sky. I mean, that was really well said. And while you were saying that, it made me think about Jesus. I mean, if we're going to use the measure that, Mark Galli was using, then Jesus doesn't even fit, because when Jesus was here, the people that he made mad were the, the ones that said, you need to follow all of these rules. Jesus' message was to the populace. He went out there and he sat with them and he ate with them and he spent time with them. And, his character and his love for the masses were what, changed the world.
Yeah, I liked what what David French said He says, if my little defensive screed is just an introduction, my little screed is an introduction to my real point. The Galley and Truman critique miss the extent to which the era of Trump created a disruption that is realigning parts of the right and parts of the left. Why would people like me write differently about race than we did in years past? Perhaps because we were exposed to shocking and shattering things that we'd never thought we'd see. We began writing differently about race not because we saw a market opportunity, but because we perceived a desperate need. And if you, like me, and if you're like me, you're more than a little ashamed that we didn't see things earlier that we plainly should have received. The deeper reality is that both left and right are changing in important ways. At the same time that parts of the left are becoming more militant and intolerant, another part is becoming more curious and open. The same thing is true on the right. So his contention is that people like Russell Moore and Beth Moore and David French and others are getting more opportunities. Esau McCauley, who we just had in last week to discuss, a piece he wrote for the New York Times. I mean, that is exactly Mark Galli's definition of a evangelical elite selling out for attention.
Right.
But he's because you're saying things that they want to hear. Karen Swallow Pryor wrote a piece that was carried in the Washington Post, I think, about the Texas abortion law where she supported it, and the Washington Post published it and got tons of hate mail, of course,
Right.
but they wanted to hear there is, because of the increasing illiberalism, both on the right and on the left, there are parts of the right and left that are finding each other to say, can't we get along and disagree? And
Yes.
so, so conservative Christians are getting published occasionally in the Atlantic and the New Yorker and the New York Times and the Washington Post because they want to exchange ideas and see how other people are thinking. And that's why Karen Swallow Pryor was invited by the Washington Post to say, what do you think? We know you're an anti-abortion activist and have been for your entire life. What do you think about the Texas abortion law? And David French gets to write for Time, and Esau McCauley gets to write for the New York Times. And if you can give me an example of them compromising on orthodoxy, please, I'd love to see it, but I don't see it.
Right.
Instead, what I see is people actually engaging with conservative Christians on ideas that affect our culture today and coming away thinking, hey, that was actually a really well reasoned position.
Right. One of the lessons I think I've learned from the last 5 years of the Trump phenomenon is one of his favorite tactics is whatever he was being accused of, he would turn around and accuse his critics of that same thing. Right. So it goes all the way back to the 2016 campaign when all those women started coming forward and accusing him of sexual assault. What did he do? He flipped it around and threw all those accusations back at Bill Clinton. When he was being accused of colluding with the Russians, he turned it around and said, no, it was the Democrats and it was the Hillary campaign that was colluding with the Russians. He always does that. And what you see going on here is, I would argue there are way, way, way more examples of Christian leaders on the conservative fundamentalist end of the spectrum who have compromised on their convictions in recent years to get on Trump's good side or to be on the side of the audience that favors Donald Trump. We've seen this. Al Mohler is a perfect example. He did a monumental flip-flop from 2016 to 2020 to endorse Donald Trump, promising he never would. But he did because he knew he's never going to be president of the SBC if he didn't. And dozens of other leaders have done the same thing. They've totally thrown in all their remarks about Bill Clinton and sexual immorality and character back from the 1990s. They've done a 180 in order to win the approval of Trump and his voters. And now what are they doing? They're turning that very accusation of appeasing the masses or trying to win the approval of others onto their own critics. So the Russell Moore, the Beth Moore, the David French, these people who stuck to their convictions, who lost their jobs and positions because they weren't willing to compromise, now they're being accused precisely of compromising to win the approval of others. It's just the irony and the gall is just astonishing. But I'm not surprised because this is what we live in the era of Trump. Whatever you're guilty of, you accuse your enemy of, no matter how
Right.
ridiculous it may seem.
Right. Last words, Christian? No? You got nothing? Come on, you got something.
No, I really don't. It's really amazing to me to think that we are in this place. And if we sit here and continue name calling and saying this group is not a Christian because they look like X, Y, and Z, I think it's a very, very sad indictment on where we are as a country and a group of Christians.
Okay, let me wrap it up before we go to the interview, because there's something that I learned that I think is very relevant, and I learned it from squirrels. If you favor the right or the left to the exclusion of the other, you can no longer learn new skills.
There you go, Phil Vischer, bringing it home.
Thank you. Thank you. And if the squirrel is dancing in front of your car, stop, because he thinks you're a hawk. He thinks it's effective, and it's going to take a few laps before he gets out of your way.
Or how about this? We need to learn from the squirrels that not all nuts are the same size, and some of them are a heck of a lot bigger than others.
Yes, and bury the biggest nuts far away so they don't mess with the others.
Yeah, chunk your
Look
nuts.
at that. Squirrel
Spatially-
facts did come in handy.
Everyone, American Christianity, spatially chunk your nuts, okay?
Put that on a t-shirt.
You can quote me on that. Okay. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. Thanks for being here for us every week, week after week. Thanks, Christian, for going to a coffee shop and renting a room so you could dial in because your house is being ripped apart and it was too loud to be there. Thanks, Jason, for being in the dark because you pulled apart your camera and you couldn't get it to work right when you put it back together when we thought we were going to have to do this somewhere else. And we will see you guys next week. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Hopefully you know by now that the Holy Post is made possible by listeners like you via Patreon. And one of the things we've been working on behind the scenes is bringing even more value and bonus material to our Patreon subscribers. In the coming days, you're going to find out about new merchandise we're going to make available just in time for the holidays. And we're doing something completely new with our monthly live stream. This month, on October 25th, our live stream will also feature a recent guest to the Holy Post, Robert Jones. He's the president of PRRI, the Research Institute, as well as the author of White Too Long. He'll be taking your questions live, and it's your chance to interact with one of the most thoughtful and interesting guests we've had on in recent months. So if you're not yet a Patreon supporter, today's the day to do it. Go to holypost.com and hit the Support Us button, and you'll learn more about all the great bonus materials you'll get access to, and you'll find out about some exciting new opportunities we'll have for our Patreon supporters in the coming weeks. So go to holypost.com and hit that Patreon support button today. Our guest today is Kate Bowler, an associate professor of history of Christianity in North America at Duke Divinity School. Kaitlyn Schiess sat down with her to talk about some of her best-selling books, including Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, and No Cure for Being Human and Other Truths I Need to Hear. Beyond her deep understanding of American church history, as well as the prosperity gospel, Dr. Bowler also uses her own journey and struggle with cancer to illuminate the shortcomings of a lot of popular Christianity and the way we understand the mystery of faith. This conversation was impactful when I first listened to it, and I know it's going to impact you as well. Here is Dr. Kate Bowler.
Hi, Dr. Bowler. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I told you a minute ago I'm going to try and restrain my fangirlingness because I have to just tell you, this is my opportunity with guests to just do my little spiel. I read Blessed my first semester of seminary, which probably tells you something about me as a person.
I love footnotes.
Yeah. And I adored it. I really did. I was really captivated and loved it. And then, fast forward a few years later, I was at the most recent Festival of Faith and Writing at Calvin College. And I saw that people were all excited to go to listen to some woman talk about cancer. And I had put no connection between these two things. And I kind of waltzed into the room like someone sort of convinced me to go. And I really was sort of totally surprised to learn that it was the same woman who had written this book that I really loved. And it so enriched my experience of listening to you talk about Everything Happens for a Reason. And the other thing I just want to say is that one of the reasons I loved it so much was because I was so surprised to encounter a woman who had done really deep academic work, but was also writing really heartfelt, popular, accessible things. And then listening to you talk to discover that you were funny and smart and
Aw.
kind. And I just think
Hey.
there's too many times, I think, for women in Christian spaces in particular, where you kind of have to pick a lane and be one kind of
Yes.
person. And
Yeah.
I just so love that you bring your whole self to being an
Aw.
academic, to being a writer, to being this funny, smart speaker. And so just thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Wow. What a kind intro. Thank you. And you called me Dr. Bowler, and people have not called me Dr. Bowler in a while. So that it feels good. Thank you. Academia is a strange place. I think you're exactly right, especially for women. And so often we have to segment the parts of who we are. And I guess that was the one of the main sort of bits of dynamite that cancer sort of added to my life is it sort of it like blew down all the partitions that I had tried to make between I really want to be a serious historian, and I also want to be a faithful Christian. I'll keep most of that biz to myself, and and
Yeah.
and then our lives. But I think because I was so scared of not living, I remember telling myself, Kate, I don't think you can afford a lot of pride. And so I decided that I would not put pride high on my list.
I love that. I just, appreciate you greatly. Will you tell, for people who might not be familiar, just as long as you would like, a version of your story? I feel like I've kind of followed it through your books that relate a lot to that. But would you just tell people kind of a version of how you've ended up writing this book, but also the prior ones that you've written?
Yeah, well, I was my dad's a historian, and all I ever wanted to be was a historian. And I grew up in the middle of Canada, around adorable cheese-eating Mennonites, and we were a humble people, but this very shiny version of American theology came to town. It was this enormous megachurch that popped up on the outskirts of town, and I genuinely thought it was a factory. And it turns out that it was Canada's largest megachurch, and that it was a prosperity megachurch, which is this belief that God wants to give you health and wealth and happiness. And the idea that Mennonites, who are, pacifists and communalists, and typically only showy about them being not showy. Like you say something like, where'd you get that shirt? And they're just like $2, $2 from Walmart. Thanks. And so I just fell in love with the idea of trying to solve a puzzle, which is how did this idea that our lives should always be fixable and good, better, best make its way not just into the States but everywhere. So that's really what I did for all of my 20s. Is I was in this sort of never-ending American school program, as you have also been. So you just keep going to school forever, and so in my bachelor's and my master's and my PhD, I just kept visiting mega churches and trying to interview their pastors and televangelists and ask this hard question, which is, can we ever figure out like the math or the formula for making our lives add up? And so I wrote all that in the first history of the prosperity gospel. This book, thank you for reading. It's called Blessed, A History of the American Prosperity Gospel. And it's so funny because the word blessed wasn't yet like this cultural juggernaut and the most used hashtag on Instagram. So I still look back and think like, man, I should have bought the website for blessed.com. I don't know why they but
You
so
have
I've
it
been trying
made.
to that would have been my golden parachute. So I really had set up my life to have this very nerdy, specific dream, and I had paid a lot into it. And as you know, academia really has it's like a train with two stops. Like the first stop is like, hey, maybe I'd like to get a PhD, and then I don't know, a decade later you get kicked off, and you're like, what happened? So I bought into this very, very expensive profession and this very dreamy life that I'd hoped for myself. And then I was very suddenly diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, like completely out of the blue, with no cancer in my family. And I went from someone with plans to live until 80 with my fleet of grateful graduate students to someone who was going to need to figure out pretty quickly how to wrap things up. And so I guess since then, those are the kinds of books I've written, is about the advice we get about how to spend our time and wrap it up and get it done. And so I wrote this. The first one I wrote was called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, about really like the crisis of faith. Like, how do you live when the formulas for, don't worry, your suffering is all part of God's plan. Don't worry, heaven will be great, like all that kind of thing. But then I kept living, which was a miracle and a surprise. But I wrote this book, No Cure for Being Human, because I realized that I was good at a crisis, but I had no idea really how to move forward with things I didn't pick.
Yeah. I saw you recently on social media, I think, post something about how you couldn't believe a publisher would let you call a book No Cure for Being Human, which I love, because as someone who has like the tiniest experience with publishers, like, yes, that's surprising that you could have such a kind of dark and also universal title. But then having read the book, I realized, sometimes titles for books are sort of just like, here's a general idea of it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's trying to draw people in. But I realized as I read the book that No Cure for Being Human wasn't just like a helpful title because it described some themes in the book, but it really was sort of this kind of horrible, but also very true and in some ways hopeful principle. Like, this is just a true thing that describes how people's lives are. Could you talk a little bit about that phrase, or even how you got to that, what that kind of means in the context of your life, but also in general?
I started saying No Cure for Being Human to myself because we all love cliches because they're usually sort of back pocket little bits of wisdom that have some kind of, but I needed something to say that felt like an antidote to the things I was hearing all the time, which is that you should be always be able to fix your life, and like you're invincible, and the power to change your life is always inside of you. And meanwhile, I mean, on the outside, I I was like such a believer. Like I'm very hardworking. I'm very resourceful. I'm like very scrappy. So I was like, well, if anyone is going to navigate this obstacle course called garbage diagnosis, like, it is going to be me. And so I kept attempting to perform my way out of the truths of it, which were that I was stuck with a diagnosis that really I was not going to be able to solve myself. Like, I was never going to be able to cook up the immunotherapy drugs I needed to live, or, or that said that all of the kind of kick cancer's ass sort of attitude, or like progressive victory, was so wildly untrue, because the truest thing about me was that I'm not invincible, that my life was going to be taken apart by things I didn't choose, and that a single moment could entirely alter the course of what I thought was possible. And so I needed to practice saying something that helped me try to make a little more peace with being so delicate and so contingent on stuff I couldn't muscle my way out of. But if you saw me on the outside, I'd be like very cheerful, very certain, super helpful patient. I was like, oh, I am always like the first one to sign up for those like cultural scripts of you can do it on your own. Just try.
Yeah. One of the things I really appreciate about you and your work is how, like I said, I first read Blessed, this thick academic book about the prosperity gospel, but I love how since then you've kind of cracked open that concept and that phrase and shown how it infects so many other places that we might not think the prosperity gospel is. I want to read this quote because it's meaningful to me, because I literally was writing about the concept of the prosperity gospel in our politics, and I was trying to kind of get a handle on how to introduce to people the idea that maybe the prosperity gospel is not just a pastor with a jet asking for your seed money, but it might be something, bigger than that.
Yeah.
And this is something you wrote in a New York Times article a few years ago. The prosperity gospel has taken a religion based on the contemplation of a dying man and stripped it of its call to surrender all. Perhaps worse, it has replaced Christian faith with the most painful forms of certainty. The movement has perfected a rarefied form of America's addiction to self-rule, which denies much of our humanity, our fragile bodies, our finitude, our need to stare down our deaths at least once in a while, and be filled with dread and wonder. At some point, we must say to ourselves, I'm going to need to let go. And I think that concept of certainty is so much easier to describe to people. Here's where you might be believing a prosperity gospel is you think, and I related to so much in your book because I'm starting off on an academic, I have a sense of where my life is leading me. And I have a sense that, of course, it will work out these ways.
Yeah.
But it's also really terrifying to think that the answer to that is to just be like not certain about things just kind of
You're
give
like,
up.
I see the pitfalls of one direction, yet the other feels very unattractive.
Yeah. So what do
yeah.
we do with that?
I think it's so easy to replace the word faith with the word certainty, especially if you grow up in very Protestant, very pietistic traditions in which we're certain of our beliefs. We're given, we're certain of our doctrines and our dogmas, but except that, I think that we have been infected with that American therapeutic individualism that tells us that we are accidentally part of some kind of broader view of sanctification. Like we're not just becoming more holy, that our lives will always improve. And I know that I thought that, I know you're never allowed to say like, I'm a good Christian. Like I'm a really good Christian. It's like you're never really allowed to say that. But I was like a pretty good one. And I felt like I was kind to strangers, not a dink to live with. I had a church and I teach at a seminary, and it was hard to know even what the word faith meant. If I kept trying to answer finish that sentence. It was like faith in God too. Like to do what? What do we really, like what are the only promises embedded in the story we have about a suffering God and a world that is not yet saved? I wanted to be more nuanced and honest about that, but that felt very difficult when I would rather say, I have faith that God will never give me more than I can handle or make the math of my life add up.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that another thing I really appreciate about this book in particular, and also about Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lives I've Left. I feel like when I say it, I have to say the whole thing or someone might get the wrong idea. One of the things I love about it, I this last year went through a really traumatic church catastrophe that was drawn out and painful and honestly a kind of suffering I had never experienced before. And I think that was the first time in my life that I had the experience of receiving from people really trite, silly things because they didn't know what to say. And, they were struggling to find words and they ended up saying really ridiculous things. And the thing that this book, actually, No Cure for Being Human, helped me put language to was I realized that what people kept doing that was so painful was so quickly after the event asking, well, what have you learned? Or how have you grown into a better person because of this? Or how have you, and I wanted sometimes to say, yeah, there are ways I've grown. There are things I've learned, but would I honestly, like, this sounds like a bad Christian thing to say, but I would trade those things I've learned for not having had this horrible thing happen.
Absolutely.
So I hadn't, until I read the book, kind of realized that that's this strange impulse that we have, because I've done it to other people too, of like, oh, but you gained this other thing or you learned this thing. Where does that come from? Why do we do that? Is there, I don't know, I guess maybe it's the the person in me that thinks if I could figure out why we do that, maybe we could stop doing it.
Yes, totally. Well, if you don't mind, I'll probably just blame America again. But I do
Go for
think
it.
there's two little strains in there that push against the mystery, right? And the mystery is our lives are contingent. We are blown about by things we can't control.
Yeah.
And we very frequently have things happen that will have absolutely no discernible reason for it. And if we could, we would always say, in a before and an after, before was better. All those things I think are true that are very unpopular to say at parties. But I do think that American pragmatism and its instrumentalism, that everything always has to be for something, is also the volume on that is really high in this culture. So you can't just have pain. It has to be useful pain. You can't just, and you apply that to a Christianity, which has cosmic math, that God will someday save the world, dry every tear, and make all things well. And that the salvation of the world and God's story about us, which is true and beautiful and an anchor dropped in the future. But that for that bit to be true, it has to be true of you today in the middle of your horrible thing. And, can't you then be saved in this, realize the way that God is still working? I mean, I find that it feels like we're all acting like sort of God's like hype man. It's like showing up like for some reason, I'm picturing DMX's One Whistle guy, where it was just like tweet, 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 just like, are you ready for this? And like, as if we're just like constantly ready to explain what God is doing.
Yeah.
And instead of saying, and then the winds changed and my life was utterly different, or in your case, that the bride of Christ was also a source of tremendous cruelty and pain, and I don't know right in this moment how to disentangle the true things from its manipulation. I mean, it would be wonderful to be able to say things like that more often.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something else that struck me from the book, sort of related to that, which is I love that you wrote this book not after any sort of end to a story, but in a certain sense, kind of after, to say that there's also this strangeness when you're in the midst of that suffering and people are saying those terrible things and you're trying to work through, how do I tell the truth about suffering? There's almost, and I love how you wrote about this in the book, that there's almost a sense in which, you do have moments of realizing the beauty of things in the world and of your relationships. And then regular life sort of begins again. And like, you don't know, you don't know
garbage life.
Yeah.
You just traffic, just inbox.
You don't know what to do. And, but also that there's this, it's not completely over and you're just back to normal life. And one of my favorite parts is when you were talking about a psychologist helping you kind of process some things and saying, you can't just live, though, in the fear that this thing is going to come back, or that that your body's going to continue to not work, or that, and I bring it back to this idea of church trauma too, because I know so many people listening can relate to either some illness in themselves or their family, or heartbreakingly, so many of them can relate to that idea of having some church trauma, but that there is this fear that continues afterwards. Like, I'm kind of moving on with my life, but how do I know that I've now realized that my life is really vulnerable to suddenly becoming ill, or I've realized that church isn't always a safe place, or I've realized that the certainty that I thought I had is like broken now, but that I can't live in fear. And I'd love to just hear you talk about your relationship to fear and how we think about that well, because there is a kind of triumphalist prosperity gospel version that says we're just not afraid of things. But then there is a reality of I love the language that you wrote about in the book, of not living there, of not staying there.
I guess I pictured it like the edge of a cliff, and that you can feel the upward draft, and that's you kind of feel your toes curled over the edge. And I have that feeling every time I have a scan to see if there's new cancer, and there very frequently is. So it's not like I'm sort of inventing new things to be worried
Yeah.
about. Like
Yeah.
I guess that was because that was one sort of qualification I had with a psychologist where I was like, but what happens if the fear is real? Like it's not
Yeah.
just the inventions or elaborations of my own experience. And I was like, well, what would you do if I was afraid of heights? And he's like, oh, we just take you up to the top of we could try taking you up to the top of a roof and just let you, hang out there. And it's called exposure therapy. And I was like, great, great, great. What if the roof caved in just multiple times? Like, then, in what way are you supposed to get over that scenario? And we
Yeah.
both laughed. But I think that's the feeling people have is like, yes, I tried to get over this, but the roof keeps caving in. How
Mm.
do I live like this? And I guess I've tried a couple things that have really helped. One is just being able to acknowledge, and our culture's endless futurism, we're very bad at acknowledging the weight of what has been, because we're always trying to say like no regrets or push forward.
Mm.
But
Mm.
I didn't realize how much, because of I've had a pretty significant number of surgeries, that I had a lot of medical trauma that I was not
Mm.
just really not sure how to deal with, because I imagine myself as just a mind to overcome, and we're not
Yeah.
just minds; we're spirits and
Yeah.
bodies. And so I went to see a therapist who is very sensitive about questions of medical trauma. So that was
Mm.
a very helpful way for me to start processing the way that it. I always do this, like I touch my chest because it's where
Mm.
my port was, like the way
Mm.
we hold things in our body. So just giving a
Mm.
little more permission to be embodied, which I really honestly did not have language for. And I'm so grateful for the rise of trauma studies, because I do think it
Mm.
helps us sync up sometimes things that feel very disjointed. So that was very helpful. But I think part of it was allowing. I will say one other thing. One other thing is just acknowledging how lonely it is. When you have a
Mm.
problem that may happen again, or is not solvable, people tend to forget after it's not a crisis anymore. And like there's such
Mm.
a long loneliness in still having a problem that persists. And so we need to have people who just the deep work is just in saying, oh, I remember you're not alone. I'll carry like,
Mm.
and just
Mm.
that if anyone has a friend who's been through a crisis, a wonderful way is just like put a little note in the calendar for 3 months from now that just says, ask
Mm.
blank about, the passing of
Yeah.
their dad or their end of their relationship or whatever. But finding a way to live alongside other people like this, with the things we don't choose, it seems to me to be this balance between, we need to be people of good courage, like know that life
Mm.
is as hard as it feels, and also people of hope. Is like, I do think the miracle of our faith, and also just of life itself, is that when we know we can't carry ourselves even throughout the day, we do have to trust in the absolute miracle of other people popping up,
Mm.
little
Mm.
glimmers of joy and, you know, wonderful, horrible natural revelation, like sunsets and etc. But I do think these little pockets of things are there to remind us that even in our contingency, we are so beloved, and like just bubble
Mm.
wrapping ourselves back in that love. I think it helps
Mm.
us um, know that, yes, you probably have every good reason to be afraid.
Mm.
And even so, we also need to be people of hope. So I think fear is so tricky, because I
Mm.
always want to be like, yes, yes, we
Yeah.
should be very afraid. And no one likes that, but I think it's true.
No, I think one of the things about your work that is so helpful is for people to kind of be, and something so lovely about your whole approach to it is like kind of making it less intense or scary to just be like, yeah. I mean, I think I've heard you say once something about being the person who shows up at birthday parties and is like, we're all going to die.
Yeah.
There's something useful. There's something really, I don't want to say useful because that's so the opposite of what we're thinking about, but there's something so important about people who have been through
Yeah.
something really difficult and can kind of help us remember it without it being immobilizing. Like help
Yeah,
us
that's right.
remember it in a way that is still conducive, like you said, to hope and to action.
Yeah.
Um and so that's what I'm curious too about the process of writing these books, especially everything happens for a reason, and No Cure for Being Human. I'm sure even hearing you talk in the books about writing them, the process of doing that while you're going through the things that you're writing about. But
Yeah.
what has that been like to talk to other people about both of them since then? I mean, what has it been like to I think back when I heard you speak at Festival of Faith and Writing, you so like humorously and like wonderfully talked about some of those horrible things that people say when they find out you have cancer. And then I watched some people get up to the mic and
Oh, yeah.
say some of those things.
Yeah, like, they're like, "Great, and 3, 2, 1." But don't you
Yes.
believe that you've had an incredible perspective?
Yes. So
Yeah.
what has that, how do you
Yeah.
think, I mean, you talk a little bit in this book about vocation. So maybe how do you think about that vocationally, but also just
Yeah.
how do you think about that with people who, I'm sure there's instances where it's people who are going through something similar and it's so life-giving. And then there's
Mhm.
times when it's people who aren't, and like you've written about, are freaked out or don't know what to do, or
Yeah.
just what has
Yeah.
that been like?
Yeah. Yeah, because it is true that the world is not safe for people in pain. And then the second you say the tender thing, that very often someone um someone sort of runs roughshod over our
Mm,
most tender thoughts. And that is so
yeah.
that does happen a lot. And I guess I guess the bit that's been so wonderful though is I started the podcast uh out of the book Everything Happens, and so I just
Hmm.
made it like Everything Happens, period. And that was just I thought that
That's
was
the
funny.
truth.
I just thought it was funny, and, and so but, once I started having those conversations, I did feel, significantly less, um,
Mm,
alone
mm,
and frightened. I think maybe because so many other people had had those terrible things said to them, and it was so much easier to identify in someone else. Like, for instance, in sharing personal details, very often if you write about something that's painful, then a very common criticism you'll get is that you're capitalizing off of your pain, or that you're so all of a sudden you're not
mm,
telling the truth, you're a capitalism monster. And at first I
mm,
was like
mm,
I thought, oh, what it or you only write about these, like you're just a lot of sort of disparaging comments about like using cancer, or and things that really used to hurt me. But then it
mm,
helped so much in talking to other people and hearing them articulate the same criticism, and me just realizing, oh no, I mean the the gift is that community helps cure us of some of the narcissism of pain. Like we get to be together,
mm,
having the weight of this, but also like the pain is also where the wisdom comes, like the hard won crap we never would
mm,
have picked, but here we are. And it feels really lovely to have just a couple things there that I feel like I have been able to build my life on. And no one has to
mm,
agree, but it sure feels amazing to be able to be surrounded by so many other people who are stuck in their befores and afters, and now feel like
mm,
it gives me back the kind of citizenship that I felt like was taken away the second I got sick. I
mm,
was like the suffering person. I was like on the other side of
mm,
plexiglass, way over there. And now I feel like I've got a whole community of people who say like it is really hard to be a person in pain in the world. And
mm,
here's just a couple little things that bring me back to the like belovedness of my own
mm,
ridiculous life. So that has helped. The podcast kind of
mm.
did a lot for me because it gave me language, and that's really what I needed, is just like a few more categories to live inside.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you said it like that, because I feel like that's what both of these books have done for people, is give them language for things. I mean, I felt reading this book, there were so many points when I thought, I have never thought of it that way, but that is exactly how it
Oh,
is.
thanks.
Um, and I think I'm someone who really cares also about the habits, the practices, like the embodied things that we do with our lives. And so one of the things I left the book thinking it was the first thought, I was like, oh, I'm so excited I can just ask her this.
Oh,
It's the best when you've read a book and it's like, oh, I have a question, but like I'm going to talk to her, so I will ask her.
yeah.
Um, love when you talk in the book about not liking bucket lists. And
Yeah.
it reminded me of how much I hate the kind of like thought experiment people will do of, if you only had one day to live, what would you do?
Yes.
Because it's ridiculous. Like,
It's
if I only had
ridiculous.
one day to live, I would fly across the country to see my parents. I would give all my money away. But like, I'm not going to do that today.
Every day.
Right. Like,
Yes.
that's not realistic. And
Yeah.
yet the like tiny little nugget of truth in that phrase is like, how do I live
Mhm.
with the recognition that everything is sort of contingent, and that I'm not guaranteed anything, and that all of my best laid plans could go to waste.
Yeah.
And so I love reflecting on that idea of that tension. And we've been talking about that, how we kind of hold both those things. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've thought at all about what it might look like in our lives to take on practices or spiritual disciplines or something that could help us, if it's true that we learn often through our bodies
Mhm.
and through repetition, what might it look like for us to try and capture that kind of idea that I want to hold in myself the
Mhm.
reality that nothing is certain? What might it look
Mhm.
like to do that?
Mhm. Nothing is certain. Yeah. Yeah. I because I've always I've struggled a lot with the how then might we live kind of problem, because
Mm-hmm.
I have two very different entirely competing modes that I get into. And one is the human bulldozer who gets lots of things done. She's very efficient. And then this other one that and I guess like the bulldozer mode is I'm very good at managing my minutes.
Mm.
And on this other version, which is the what would you do if this was your last day on earth kind of feeling, is what kind of, I always think like, what kind of moments would you want to live inside that it would help
Mm.
encapsulate like all the best loves you have.
Mm.
And it seems like if we want to do good in the world, that we actually do have to be pretty good at managing our minutes. We can't just be like
Mm.
wonderfully wildly narcissistic and run around YOLOing our but I guess in terms of my like spiritual attention, I find them most acutely when I get better at the moments side of me,
Mm.
because this has made me much more sensitive to the pain of other people, like much
Mm.
more.
Mm.
So it's not something I do at the same time every day, because for some reason I am incapable of creating routines. But one thing I do try to do is every single day, I let a moment, like a thing that probably could have just been in passing, like absolutely take over whatever was supposed to happen in that moment.
Mm.
And then I try to settle in. I feel it often when I go to the cancer center. Like at first I'm kind of bracing because I'm scared. And then the
Mm.
second I settle in for a second and like breathe the air, which always smells like burnt grilled cheese, which I don't understand. But I take a minute to look around, and then all of a sudden all the details start popping up, like all
Mm.
the person who is slumped over on someone else's strong shoulder, the fatigue or kindness of the receptionist. Like I start
Mm.
to so this is something I've really started making sure that happens every day, is just settling in long enough to watch other people be magic. Like just
Mm.
it surprises me every time. Like
Mm.
someone being hilarious or someone being kind, and so I let a moment take over. And that reminds me again, I always just find myself like filled with gratitude to God that God made us so weak and fragile, but
Mm.
so soft, you know? And so, yeah,
Mm.
that is something I would have had bulldozer Kate like 24 hours a day last time, but now I I do see the miracle of this, and I do wait long
Mm.
enough to kind of be surprised by it.
Mm. I love that. Thank you, Dr. Buller, for, I mean, truly for the gift of these books and the gift of your whole self in all of them. I, like you said earlier, I think it
Aw.
would be easy to be a different person in each of these kind of spheres. And I so appreciate you being your whole self and you
Aw.
taking the time to talk today.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. You are wonderful at this. You should,
Oh.
as my dad says to me at the end of every phone call, I'll follow your career with interest.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.